Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be going over my top fiction books from the year. And like with the non-fiction list, I've tried to, as much as possible, make this books that were released this year or very late last year. Mostly just because I think there is a difference between those recent books that have come out that you really enjoy and something about the kind of backlisted ones where I could have read them in a year in theory as well, right? Anyway, that's a weird bit of preamble from this very dark room. I've been sort of trying to get bits of light today to film, and no, this is what we've got. So, but I want to go over these fiction books that I've read this year that I've loved, and it's just been such an interesting year for fiction and just for books that I've read and loved. Certain book prizes will have sort of influenced me picking up certain books, and so you'll see certain prizes, particularly the Booker, represented. But what's been really exciting to see as well when I've looked back over this is also just to realise how many indie presses have ended up being in my top books this year, and that's really quite fun. I think also speaks to the fact that so many indie and small presses are really doing incredible work at finding amazing voices to kind of represent and bring out this incredible writing, but also just that I think my own reading tastes from being on BookTube have meant that I've sort of slowly started to find other things that I didn't realize existed before, and so as a result I've been able to find so many really cool, interesting books that I'm just really excited to talk about. So without further ado, let's get started talking about some of those books. So these books are in no particular order, and also it should be said that this sort of list of 12 is also largely as well based on books that have really stuck out for me. So some of these weren't necessarily books that I gave 5 stars to at the time, but that have really lingered in my brain. And so there may be some books that did have 5 stars that are not on this list, but some books that I gave 4 stars to, but I've not really stopped thinking about, and so pretty much would call 5 stars now anyway. But anyway, the first one I did give 5 stars to when I started off the year, and look, it's a Booker Prize winner. What a surprise! But Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree, translated by the wonderful Daisy Rockwell, I think is just such an incredible book. I think a very, very deserving winner of the International Booker Prize this year. It is just so exciting in so many ways for a book that's 700 and something pages. It reads incredibly quickly, not only because there are some pages that have very little text on them, but also it's just such a delight of a book to read. It's a family epic talking about the lives of people whose sort of political and personal identity have been split in various ways. So the partition between sort of India and Pakistan comes up quite sort of frequently in this book and is a core part of what's going on here. And particularly this sort of old woman trying to trace back her steps to find out a little bit more about, to kind of relive bits of her history. Meanwhile, there's this sort of ragtag group of people, this really fabulous cast of characters who are all so interesting and quirky and just fun. And I just think, above all else, the thing that really set this book apart from me and is made it just one of the easiest picks for my top books of the year is just how clever the wordplay is in this book. And I don't know how Daisy Rockwell translated this so fabulously and captured this sort of playfulness of language from one language to another in this way, but it's just a joy to read this book. And I can't say that I've necessarily read that many other 700-page books that have always been such a joy to go through. So this, has to be one of my books of the year easily. I think released late last year, but I'm going to count it for this year because I think this is the year where it's really landed in many ways. On a similar note, I loved Elena Knows by Claudia Piñeiro. And translated by Francis Riddle, I believe. I haven't got it to hand. I will add the right thing in the notes. But what I really enjoyed about this book is just the way that in such a short amount of pages, it conveys so much. So the story of Elena Knows is a mother looking to the sort of disappearance of her daughter. And she's convinced that something's happened and that she's going to track this all down and she's going to solve the mystery. Meanwhile, her body is the thing that she's seemingly fighting as well. Her health, I believe it's Parkinson's disease in the book, is a sort of constant affront to her ability to do this. And so she just has this really interesting perspective of being a woman who is sort of battling what feels like a sort of ticking clock of her body to try and solve a crime and solve everything, but in the meantime is just really trying to process feelings of grief and loss and fear and everything else. I think this is a stunning book. It's just a really beautiful way of looking at this mother-daughter relationship in a way that I think is so tender, but so laced with so many of the things that we all feel often in sort of close relationships and family relationships, of just this utter terror and fear that can pulse through so much of our lives. I think this is just a phenomenal book. And Charco Press are a press I've been meaning to check out more of as well, because the few I've read of theirs I've just found really exciting, and I realise I haven't really been reading that much Latin American literature, so also really exciting on that front. But yeah, easily a top book of the year for me. Next up, we have The Voids by Ryan O'Connor, and this is a book I read really early in the year, just around the time it came out, and I just found this a really profoundly beautiful book, a book that I'd been enjoying anyway as it went all the way through, and then this final passage of the book just was this incredible rush and blur of just the most stunning language and sort of this sort of moment of the clouds clearing and the sort of true aspect, some other true aspects of this book really rising to the surface, and I just found it really beautiful and profound. I also had the absolute pleasure and honour of interviewing him earlier this year to talk about the book, and it was even more exciting just to be able to hear his thoughts on how the book had come together, his thoughts around it all. But essentially the core part of this book for me, and sort of the core story, I guess, of this book is that we are looking at a man struggling with sort of processing reality and everything going on around him and his addiction and sort of various other things happening in his life, all around the time of him living in these sort of deserted or kind of these condemned tower blocks in Glasgow. And this sort of bleak landscape also sort of doesn't, I think, fully sell what actually happens in this book. This is a book so full of warmth and love and kindness, and we see these little interactions between people that are so full of love and community. And I just think it's a really stunning book. I think it's really beautifully told. It's really sensitively handled. And I think it's been a real gem of this year just to read a book like this and just bask in the beauty of this world that Ryan O'Connor has created and shared with us all. I just think it's a fabulous book, and yeah, really glad to have read it this year as well. Keeping within Scotland, also Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart, a book that at one point I read it around the same time as The Voids, and I think also February is obviously also, or February, March, whenever this came out, is also a month obviously where it's a bit cold and a bit dark, especially in the UK, and I remember reading the last part of this book whilst in bed on a very cold dark night, just like huddled up with all my bed sheets. And what came up in this book was just such a beautiful moment of these two young boys, and the fears and bits of shame they had, and that these sort of aspects of masculinity and everything else that goes on as they grow up and try and navigate the world. And a big part of this book is sort of, you know, in some ways picking up a little bit after Shuggie Bain. It's a different story, different characters, but it sort of belongs within that universe almost of, you know, characters like them, where could they be a bit later on? And this sort of dawning sexuality and growth of sort of understanding in who they are sort of really pulses through this book. And I just found it an absolutely stunning but I just thought it was so beautifully told. I was completely in love with how it was told, the kind of the absolute fear that is on some pages that really gripped me, because I think it was so beautifully rendered to capture those moments of what shame and fear can do to somebody, particularly somebody working out their sexuality and understanding who they are. And the sort of range of characters in this book is so sensitive. I think the thing I found with both Shuggie Bain and this is we go to some incredibly dark places with characters. They do some things that seem so irredeemable and so awful, but there's so much love in the telling of this story and so much care. And so as a result, nobody in this book is just pure evil. Nobody is a sort of easy straw man of this person's just terrible. In fact, it almost intentionally resists that, and characters in this book are sort of stuck within difficult situations, often doing the only things that they know how to do, and using the only tools they've got at their disposal. And I think that's what I found so beautifully moving about this book, and makes it one of my favourites for the year. Next up, we have Bolla by Pajtim Statovci, and which I've almost definitely said incorrectly. But this book is the story of a man who, in many ways similar to sort of young Mungo, is working out his sexuality and working out who he is. But it's set against this context of some really quite complicated things happening in sort of basically former Yugoslavia and sort of many of the kind of countries kind of around it. And so there's this sort of time of upheaval, of political instability, of war, of these sort of very strange and porous national and racial lines, where somebody can be seen as Bosnian by one person and as belonging to another country by another person, and all of those carry with them distinct categories of where we might expect to find those people, and the stereotypes around them and all these things. And against this backdrop, we have this young man who is sort of looking at bits of his sexuality and sort of trying to understand himself, and he makes some awful decisions. He's often a terrible man, and there's, again, almost like with young Mungo, there's a sort of understanding that he maybe can't always make some of the best decisions here because of things going on around him, and that actually there often isn't a good decision to be made, because you always have to be fairly alert to the fact that somebody might try and knife you, or somebody might use information they have about you and your sexuality to blackmail you. And that does happen in this sort of really complicated scene with a young man who he sort of wants to sleep with. And there's a real violence to that scene that's really uncomfortable to read. And where a lot of that violence then kind of settles in the rest of this book is we see this as both an acting out of this sort of very toxic idea around manhood and masculinity and what else, and also a sense of fear and loss and so many things. And it's a really complicated moment. And I think what this book does so well is capture the nuances of that condition of, if you are trapped between these two things, between having to be a certain person externally and who you are inside, or whatever else, you might act in these weird, irrational ways. But equally, all of these things can come back and find you. As he makes awful decisions, he's often a terrible, terrible man. And I don't think we're meant to end the book excusing him for many of these things. But I think what it does do really well as a book is shine a light on some of those complexities of being human. I quite like having books with quite messy LGBTQ characters, because it's a messy existence being human, and adding in other factors of being marginalized or whatever else just add to this picture. And so I think this book particularly captures that very, very well. Now, inevitably, we get into Booker season, and there are a few books here that I just really, really loved, and I just think were standouts for me of the year. So The Colony by Audrey Magee, which, if I'd had it my way, would have been the winner. Like, this is obviously, it's judges making a decision. It's, in the grand scheme of things, this doesn't matter like what I think and who I would have chosen as the winner. But for me, The Colony was just one of the most incredible books I read this year. I think what's so interesting about it is how it grounds so many aspects of identity and conflict and tension into one narrative. So at the heart of it is we have this painter who's come to an area of Ireland and is sort of just being a painter and sort of being part of it. He is English, and the sort of tensions of England and Ireland come up a little bit within that itself. But what also comes up really is that this is an island within Ireland, or an area that is that has a kind of complicated relationship with its own history as well. It's and its culture. There are people living locally who were native sort of Irish Gaelic speakers. There are people who have never learnt any of that and don't intend to. And then we get these really interesting conversations come up within the book around, well, actually, you know, why would I learn Gaelic? I can get by perfectly well with English, and I shouldn't need that. And who cares? It's just a language anyway. And there's a linguist on the island who's fighting to say, you know, I think he's from France, and he's saying, no, you've got to protect this. This is really important. This is a core part of who you are. And then people saying, well, no, it isn't. Like, who are you to tell me that speaking Gaelic or Irish is who I am. Like, actually, I can be Irish and not speak it. And so at the heart of this book are already some really quite complicated conversations around that. But then it factors in other parts of Irish history. So we get references to bombings that take place throughout the book, and they're delivered in these very short chapters that are basically, that are basically newspaper cuttings. And so there's something quite profound about suddenly having the narrative interrupted to have something like this crop up. It's a really heartbreaking book at times, and I just think is really well done. And I think the audiobook, which is how I read most of it, I think also really added something to it, because there's a real pace and a rhythm to it. You know, there are lots of line breaks in the sort of written text that I just think that really kind of carry this sort of momentum through the book. I just think it's wonderful. I think it's a brilliant book. Still a little bit, you know, I mean, obviously, get over it, Bob. It's happened. But, you know, I would have loved to have seen this on the shortlist. I think this is a book that really deserved a little bit of extra love. And actually all the Booker ones I'm going to be talking about were longlisted instead of shortlisted. So it looks like I'm on a sort of, I've got like a, you know, like an axe to grind. But I think just that these were books that I think are beautiful and worth celebrating. So carrying on with the Booker and sort of books I read for that. After Sappho by Selby, Wynn, Schwartz, I really have been thinking about a lot since. I was sort of hovering between 4 and 5 stars when I first read it and thought it was something quite special. And then I've thought about this quite a lot since. And I really love how this book muddles this idea of what is fiction, what is non-fiction. I really love that it shouldn't work, right? We're basically sort of almost like sort of darting between little vignettes and little stories of people, and particularly famous, what we'd now term lesbian or bi women, but sort of would have had different labels, and you know, they would have seen themselves differently at the time, but sort of modern parlance, I guess, would call them sort of lesbian and bi women, or sort of queer women, and their lives at a very specific point in history. And there's something about the way this narrative is woven together that I found really compelling. I sort of read it like I would a novel. I was really inside the heads of some of these women's lives and how it all connects together. And there's something so brilliant about the way that this has been constructed. It shouldn't work, but it does, and it does it so beautifully and so brilliantly. And I think for me, just seeing how we can still keep blowing up these ideas of what fiction and non-fiction can be is so exciting, but also to do so in a way that really captures the voices of women who have often been not really thought about particularly much in history, or have been sort of footnotes to other characters' lives, I think was really bold and groundbreaking, and I really loved this book for that as well. Carrying on with the Booker, also Case Study by Graeme, Macrae, Burnet, I thought was just such an interesting book. This was a difficult one because I was trying to choose between a few others as well. But and you know, there were other books on the Booker list, sort of short list or long list, that I perhaps enjoyed more on a certain level, or you know, I might have given 5 stars to, whereas Case Study was sort of hovering between a 4 and a 5. But I think what I really wanted to celebrate with this book was just how I think it really just does something so clever. I've thought about this again a lot since, because this book intentionally problematizes how we're going to approach a book. So we are sort of told right at the beginning, we have GMB, sorry, I think, delivering a message, and we just assume naturally as readers that that's Graeme, Macrae, Burnet. But is it him? Is it another GMB? Is it something else? And this book constantly sidesteps you and makes you second guess everything. Largely, we're told that this is the story of a woman who, after a sibling dies, wants to find out some answers from a psychologist who was with her. And that's a very basic way to describe the plot, but it takes so many different sort of tangents off that. We get diary entries from this woman where we suddenly start to question her grip of reality and whether what she's telling us is true or a character being played. We have excerpts of a sort of biography into the psychologist himself, where we also find that he's not particularly trustworthy. And sort of at every stage, we're meant to distrust what's happening to us as a reader. And I really like that as an experience. I remember just sort of being sat there reading it, being like, I don't know what is in my hands. I don't know what it is that I'm reading here, but I love that there's such an excitement to being kept on your toes. And so I just think this is a really phenomenal work that I've thought about more since, and I think I find more intelligent the more I think about it, which I think is a sign of a good novel, that it has that longevity to just keep being thought about. So yeah, a really interesting one, and now you'll be relieved to hear we're moving away from the book here. We are, however, moving to a different book prize. Seven Steeples by Sarah Baume. This is a really beautiful, sumptuous book, I think. But again, where the key principle of what we might expect in a book in terms of resolution, in terms of action, are kind of subverted at most levels. The idea between behind Seven Steeples is that a couple who are almost like so made for each other, they're really great, they finish each other's sentences, they completely get each other, they take over this house that overlooks these 7 hills, these steeples and all these other things, and they have this grand plan that they're going to sort the house out, and then they're going to go and climb these hills because they did so much climbing and hiking together. And then they don't. The book takes us through year on year, the 7 years where they don't climb the hill, and the house slowly falls further into disrepair. And all of this doesn't sound like it should be quite as compelling as it is. This sounds like almost like an anti-book, right? It's sort of purposely sort of telling you about how the house is getting creakier and falling apart, and they're running lower on money, so they plaster over everything with whatever they've got at their disposal. So, but yeah, perhaps instead of sorting out the house properly, you know, fixing a hinge on a door, they might put a pin through it and try and sort it that way. And so we just get this house that slowly crumbles and crumbles and becomes less of a thing, but it told through the most sumptuous prose. And I just found this such an engaging and beautiful book, and I now really want to go back and read everything she's ever written because I just adored it so much. I really am raging against the dying of the light here. It's not actually too dark in this room, but on the camera it looks incredibly dark. Anyway, so continuing on with this, those are all the big book prizes out of the way pretty much, although also on the same Goldsmith shortlist as Seven Steeples was There Are More Things by Yara Rodrigues Fowler. And this is another one of those books that falls into the camp of, maybe when I initially read it I didn't think, you know, I mean, I really enjoyed it, don't get me wrong, but I was sort of torn on how to rate it and to think about it. And it's really stayed with me, not only because of sort of ridiculous memes and jokes within Kieran's Discord about Plek, which features in this book, but also just because I think there's so much that's really exciting about this book, and I just keep thinking about it. So essentially, a core part of this book, again, almost the plot is not the most directly essential part of it, which that's not an insult on this book. I think it does so many other things that are so exciting that I think the plot is like a nice thing that kind of is just happening, even though it's a really important plot. But the plot is sort of these 2 women whose sort of lives intersect in various ways, and there's a real conversation between the 2 of them almost about identity, because one of them has you know, they basically, one of them has recently moved from Brazil and has these sort of, you know, wants to kind of have these big discussions about being Brazilian and everything else. And this other girl sort of speaks Portuguese, like some, or understands it, lives in London and considers herself in many ways a Londoner. And so this book really then has this conversation instead about what the sort of where identity sits within that, you know, like how much do you have to be able to speak a language to be from that place or whatever. There were passages of this that I just found so deeply moving, which, given the kind of nature of it, given that it's quite playful with language, and you have sort of sounds and words that kind of are on the page just to make you think and sound out things in a certain way, it slowly moves pace, I think, is the really clever thing within this book, that it regathers this pace and this strength as it goes, because slowly you basically learn the language of this book, almost, that you start to fall into the rhythms of how it approaches things and how the characters see things, to such an extent that I was really lucky that I basically read this in 2 long train journeys. And the second of those train journeys, I was almost nervous because I was reading at like 5 or 6 a.m. Like the sun was just coming up and it was all this whole thing. And I was literally, somebody could have been having a full-on argument next to me and I wouldn't have known, because I was so into this world of this book. And actually, as it happened, there was a very annoying passenger who was just talking absolute nonsense for the whole thing. But I was tuning him out because of this book. Because once you get into the rhythms of it and sort of hear how it's talking and what it's doing, suddenly little things become incredibly devastating and incredibly powerful. So the joke thing about Plek in this book, I actually felt quite weirdly emotional when sounds like Plek started featuring into the book, because there was a real, almost like reaching out between characters with those sounds. More was being communicated than just the sound of someone typing. There was a sort of a lack of ability to communicate or understand, or things like that were happening in these small pauses between things. And it's weird, because I think it's one of those books that, this is going to be a very weird comparison, but follow with me here. There's a Kate Bush album where there's a song where she sings about a washing machine, and the first few times I listened to that song, I thought it was really funny, because she's just singing washing machine over and over, and then saying splishy sploshy splishy sploshy, and I was like, okay, this is quite funny and a bit ridiculous, and I love it. And then at some point, the emotional weight of that song hit me, where I suddenly realized what was happening, and suddenly those bits of sort of splishy sploshy transformed into something quite different. I had the same experience with this book, where at the beginning it's sort of like, oh, okay, she's making sort of funny noises and blah blah blah, and as you go further into the book, they just gain this real weight and poignancy. And I got to the end, and just I read it in this sort of breathless sort of way, and I just absolutely loved it. So that's why this book is one of my books of the year, I think, because I've thought about it so much since, and I think it does so many really clever things that were so interesting and so powerful, but all kind of hidden a little bit under the surface. And I think it's brilliant. I'm going to stop rambling about it, but it's brilliant. Next up, I Am Not Raymond Wallace by Sam Kenyon. And this may surprise none of you, because given that I've had a few videos where I did a solo review of this, where I had an interview with Sam Kenyon, I really enjoyed this book. I got a lot of joy from it. And I think it's an interesting one for me, because there were books that did different things this year that excited me in various other ways. This book just really hit me somewhere quite deep within. Because there are so many parts of this book that talk about the kind of hiding and the shame and the kind of coded conversations that queer people have with each other, that was so beautifully observed, that I just thought, yes, this is a book I'm in love with. And talking to Sam about the book as well was such a revelatory experience, because there was so much in this book that I really enjoyed, in terms of how joyous and liberating some of the sex scenes felt, and how there's a really healthy amount of sort of queer joy and fun in amongst some of the tricky bits of the season and sort of the times. Particularly as this book largely deals with ideas of sort of queer belonging. So we start with, it's sort of told over 3 different time slots, sort of zones not the right word, periods, and in the first one, we're having Raymond Wallace himself sort of telling part of his story, and it's a written form. And then we sort of then see in the second and third parts of the book how that being captured also doesn't fully capture the full experience. So he's a young man who's moved to New York to be a journalist, and he is made to cover a story that is about, you know, queer people running rampage and destroying the moral fabric of society. And he, in his role, then has to sort of assume 2 identities. He's this person writing the story and trying to tame it and, you know, temper it down so that it's less inflammatory, but also he is finding out his own sexuality and his identity, and sort of basically trying to work out who everybody is around him. And in the midst of that, we just get these beautiful, beautiful scenes of longing and desire and identity and fun and so many other things. The later part of the book deals with then people trying to comb back through his life and find meaning or find answers for unresolved things. And I just think it's a really brilliant, beautiful read, and I just urge you to check it out. I think it's a fantastic book, and it was just such a pleasure to read, and I feel so lucky that I had the chance to talk to Sam about it and then meet him in person. I think this is signed somewhere. Little signed copy there. just a joy, and this has been a book that's probably given me so much pleasure over the year. Probably some of these other ones are just, you know, fun in their own way. This book just gave me a lot of pleasure and was just such a great experience. And last but not least, a really recent addition to this list, given that I read it about a week ago, and that is Andrea Mayo's The Carnivorous Plant, translated by Laura McLaughlin. And I was wondering at first, is it recency bias that has made me think that this might be one of my top books of the year? But no, I think there's something really quite special about this book. So the core story and idea of this book is a woman in a really sort of abusive and complicated relationship. Doesn't sound like the most exciting start to a book, granted, and I get why a lot of people would find this book really quite difficult to stomach in many, many ways. But what this book does next, I think, is so clever. So firstly, every chapter is chapter one, because the story basically keeps repeating itself almost. You know, there's no escape, there's no linearity that you'd have with a typical book, right, of sort of numbered chapters where you're moving towards an end. For this character, every day is day one almost, right, of not really knowing what's coming next. But also, so much of it is told through these moments of real levity and beauty, but also absolute cruelty and desperation. And it's so beautifully crafted, I think, and really well translated, I'd assume, because it read for me so naturally and such a fantastic book. That we sort of watch as she tries to navigate what it means to be in this relationship, and how some of those bits of harm can be enacted in other parts of her life. So when she has the chance to be a better person or to have relationships with other people, how does she then navigate those, coming from where she's come from? Also in this book, just as a physical experience, it has these little sections. Let me find one. At the beginning, where there are pictures. There's a sort of picture that's slowly revealed as we go through the book. And sorry, I'm just quickly finding it. There we go. So for example, here we've got a little bit of a picture. And as we go through the book, the full picture is revealed. And actually there's something quite interesting about how the final few pages of this book are both a revelation in terms of where the story is ending, but also this picture adding context and a sort of wider discussion almost within the book of what this full picture then looks like. And I just found this really riveting and really impressive as a book. It's brutal, it's difficult, it's challenging in terms of subject matter. It is not an easy light read that you can take with you on I guess on a summer holiday, and me reading it during the winter was maybe also not a great thing, because I was like, it's already dark and cold and difficult outside, but I thought it was just so beautifully done. It's a really powerful, incredible book, and I think, you know, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I've been reading a few more indies recently, and 3 Times Press, the indie who published this, I think are just such an exciting new player in that. I have read their 3 books this year and just been really blown away by the quality and the real power of sort of voices that we don't often hear as much in fiction really being brought out. And, you know, so really, really great book, and I've just really loved this experience of reading it, as difficult and as tricky as this book was at times. And that is all of the books, my top books from the year. And I mean, last year I ended up with 12 books, because partly because I couldn't choose with 10, and also partly because I then realized that 12 was a nice easy number as well for like one per month of the year, and also just it's easier to make little grids of them and kind of have little pictures of them all together. And actually I quite like 12 as a format, because sometimes 10 is not enough. We'll see whether that will continue, but these are the ones I physically own. The other books I just think have just been such fantastic things to read this year, and I think have really reinforced to me why I love reading and why I love fiction so much. It can do so many things. In this list alone, we've got, you know, these beautiful, tender stories up against experimental forms and up against, you know, so many different ways of telling a story, and all of them just bring so much joy and sort of meaning and purpose to life without sounding really grandiose about it. So basically, reading is great. I love reading. I'm not sure if, weirdly, I think this audience might think the same here on good old BookTube. But I think these books have really reminded me just why I love reading so much. And yeah, it's been a great year. Looking forward to 2023, where I'm sure there'll be even more wonderful, wonderful books to check out. There are also many books that I'm sure would have made this list if I'd read them this year. And I'll keep an eye out for other people's lists to kind of steal from shamelessly in terms of what I'm going to read next. But have a wonderful break, well, regardless when you're watching this, really. And it's been such a joy to read these books this year. Take care. Have a wonderful 2023. Sweet to you all soon. Bye-bye.